Hello and welcome to the Layton Fitness podcast. So before we dive into today's topic, which is going to be the myth of clean eating, I thought it would be useful just to give you a brief introduction of what you can expect to hear on every episode of the podcast, in addition to a brief introduction about my personal background and my philosophy on training and nutrition. So firstly, it's important to address who is the podcast going to be for. So this is going to be for individuals looking to build muscle and or lose body fat. So some of the content may be a little bit too advanced for beginners, so it's probably going to be more suitable to the intermediate to advanced trainee. One of my main philosophies is I'm very much an evidence-based practitioner, so I believe I have a good understanding of both the science as well as the practical side of actually being in the trenches and training clients both one-on-one and via my online coaching. So that's probably going to be the biggest difference you'll find with myself in comparison to some other fitness professionals, is this concept of context. And essentially everything, both training and nutrition, should be tailored to the individual. Nothing's black and white, and you'll probably notice when I'm discussing various topics, lots of caveats being thrown out, lots of it depends, because like I said, context is one of the most important factors when you're providing training and nutrition information. So I thought I'd just give you a brief introduction about myself. So I've been personal training for about 4 years now. I'm also doing online coaching, which essentially providing people with both training and nutrition plans, in addition to making modifications to both their nutrition and training to move them closer to the goals. So with regards to my services, this isn't just a case of you give the client the nutrition plan or training plan, then you just leave them. The goal is to really coach the individual along the way to provide them with as much education as possible, in addition to making the changes if and when required. So that's important to note, that if your goal is either fat loss or muscle gain, your nutrition requirements will be ever changing in addition to your training. So therefore modifications need to be made perhaps on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis, or whenever a plateau has been reached. So I've been doing my online coaching for approximately about a year and a half now. In addition to this, I have lots of videos. I have a blog on my website. I post quite frequently on Facebook and Twitter. And I've also just launched a Inner Circle membership site, which is essentially a watered down version of my online coaching. It doesn't have the same tailored aspect of my online coaching. It essentially has lots of training programs, recipes as a calorie calculator, and it's essentially tailored for the individual that can go into the site and can pick and choose both the training and nutrition components to move them closer to their goals. So it's essentially designed for an individual to go on there to have all of the pieces to the puzzle as such, and it's up to them to essentially pick and choose the pieces required to move them closer to the goals. In addition, I have videos on there on how to make various changes, etc. However, it's not the same as my online coaching, where I'm actually specifically making the exact changes needed. In addition to my own reading kind of scientific journal articles, and following some other great mentors online, so Alan Aragon, Eric Helms, Brad Schoenfeld, who fortunately I've been to all of their seminars within the last 18 months. And I'd also like to make a big thank you to one of my mentors, Joseph Agu, who 2 years ago really opened my eyes to the evidence-based approach to training and nutrition. Whereas prior to that, I was very black and white in my approach, rather than actually looking at the evidence, looking at the weight of available evidence, being very critical, and then making my own assessment. So I hope you've got a good understanding of my philosophy and a little bit more information about myself. Now we're going to move on to the topic of conversation, which is the myth of clean eating. So unless you've been under a rock within the fitness industry, you probably heard this phrase banded around very frequently. And essentially how it's portrayed in the industry is all you need to do is just eat clean and you're going to achieve your body composition goals, mainly your fat loss goals. However, this really ignores the bigger picture. This ignores context, because just say if we had an individual who's eating quote-unquote clean food and their goal's fat loss, yet they're in 1,000 calorie surplus, that individual is still going to gain body fat regardless of the food types within their diet are considered clean or not. It really ignores total calories in addition to macronutrient, protein, carbohydrate, fats. It ignores their goals, it ignores their training frequency, it ignores all of these big factors. So unfortunately the word clean is somewhat subjective. However, there's two main characteristics that are cited within fitness professionals, and one would be that the degree of processing, and the other one would be nutrient density. So the problem with the first one, degree of processing, so essentially the point they're making is any food that's considered processed should be avoided. And even though this sounds relatively logical, again, there's still some processed food which clearly have a lot of benefit within an individual's diet, especially a trained individual looking to lose body fat or gain muscle. So a great example is obviously whey protein, derived from milk. This is actually considered processed. However, it has the full array of amino acids, a very high biological value, and has multiple benefits with minimal downsides. So to make the comment, all you need to do is just avoid processed food, again, this just ignores certain foods that are processed that have lots of benefits, like whey protein. Now, the best way I look at whey protein is this isn't a mandatory requirement within any individual's diet. The main goal should be consuming sufficient protein. So whether that individual consumes protein from whey or from other whole food sources, it really doesn't matter as long as they're complete proteins. However, for the most part, I'm still yet to have a client that actually can physically just consume whole food protein and meet a protein target. The great thing about whey protein is convenient, cost effective, and it essentially allows individuals to fill in the gaps to meet that total protein daily target. So the next commonly cited characteristic of what is considered clean is nutrient density. However, I've got a really good quote from Miller and colleagues, and the quote goes like this: "There's currently no scientific-based definition for either nutrient density or nutrient-dense foods. Without a definition that has not been developed using an objective, scientific approach, the concept of what is speech marks nutritious is subjective and therefore inconsistent." And this essentially brings me back to my philosophy in the opening of the podcast. Trying to judge foods in isolation has lots of issues because it completely ignores what an individual eats the rest of the day, what that individual eats the rest of the week, what their goals are, how frequently they're training, the type of training they're performing. These are such big factors which need to be considered. You cannot just say whether one food is good or bad in isolation without taking into account the total calories an individual is consuming on a daily basis, the total macronutrients, and all of those other factors. I'm going to give you this statement, and this is something you're probably worth writing down. The dose and composition of a food within an individual's diet is actually more important than the food itself. So let's just give you a couple of examples. Most people would consider brown rice a clean food. However, similarly to what I mentioned earlier, if an individual's in a 1,000 calorie surplus, regardless of whether that individual's consuming brown rice or sugar, that individual's going to gain body fat. Conversely, if someone has consumed something that is considered quote-unquote bad in moderation, and they're still under their total caloric requirements, they're still within their macronutrient guidelines, how could you say that that food is good or bad? So I hope you can see the bigger picture, and we looked at a clean food in a big energy surplus, the individual's still going to gain body fat. Conversely, you look at someone consuming a small amount of quote-unquote bad food in moderation within their caloric requirements, within their macronutrient targets, protein, carbohydrates, fats, they're not going to have any issues whatsoever. So that, just to clarify again, the dose and composition of a food within an individual's diet is more important than the food itself. I also wanted to bring you to an excellent video series by a guy called Eric Helms. So if you haven't already heard of Eric Helms, he's very well known within the natural bodybuilding circles. He's very much an evidence-based practitioner, but at the same time has very good practical experience as well. And he came up with a really good, almost like nutritional pyramid, and how everything within nutrition is important. However, there's a hierarchy of importance. So I'm just going to run through that now. So firstly, energy balance comes first. Total calories. That is the number one most important factor. And then underneath that we have the macronutrient composition within a diet. So protein, carbohydrates and fats. Underneath that we have micronutrients, minerals and water. Underneath that again we have nutrient timing, frequency, and underneath that supplements. So the point Eric's making is all of these factors are very important. However, you shouldn't be focusing on, say for example, nutrient timing when your goal's fat loss and you're in a 2,000 calorie surplus. One doesn't override the other. So you need to make sure that hierarchy of importance is in place first. So energy balance, total calories, then macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, fats, micronutrients, minerals and water, nutrient timing, frequency and supplements. So we're actually going to dive into all of these topics in more depth. The nutrient timing one, won't go into too much detail now, but it's more important in certain contexts. So for example, an individual who trains twice per day, say an endurance athlete, timing and frequency is much more important for this individual in comparison to, say, a weight training individual who's trained once per day. So that's just a little primer on a potential episode that's going to come later. I also just want to address a common question you may hear from certain individuals who have perhaps reduced certain food groups or food types within their diet and have consequently lost weight. So example, the typical bodybuilding circles, what's considered clean now is actually potentially taking out milk from their diet or even fructose. So one of the problems here is, let's just say an individual removes milk from their current diet. We all know that milk is relatively calorically dense, so by default just removing this, we're actually also removing calories. So just say if you've got an individual that's consuming 2,000 calories a day, then they remove milk. Let's just say for example there goes another 150-200 calories. Because they haven't replaced the milk with subsequent calories, the matching macronutrients, that individual is probably going to be in a net energy deficit and consequently is going to lose body fat. So that's a common theme that when individuals are trying to defend their clean eating, they'll say, I removed X food and I started making progress. Again, if they're just removing X food and not replacing those calories, obviously by default they're going to be consuming less calories than they were prior and therefore more likely to be losing weight. However, there's a big caveat here as well. Just say if you've got an individual that generally has an allergy to a certain food, obviously this food should be avoided for obvious reasons. So what are some of the reasons why, say perhaps bodybuilders or certain individuals in the fitness industry kind of preach this clean eating myth? And unfortunately there's almost this dogma of, I can work harder than you, I am a warrior, you're not as disciplined as I am because I can avoid social occasions, I can avoid eating X food. And it's really just a sad and unfortunate thing, because they could achieve the same results by tracking their calories, tracking their macronutrients. The other potential problem, essentially you have some nutrient deficiencies by removing certain foods, and also creates a bad relationship with food. Just say for example we're boxing these foods in as good and then we're boxing these foods over here as bad. It just creates a very bad relationship. I know from personal experience, when I was a typical clean eater, say 3-4 years ago, I'd avoid potentially social occasions. It can really kind of play with your head without question. So it just creates a bad relationship with food. It can potentially cause what's called orthorexia, which is a unhealthy obsession with healthy food. So there's another potential kind of psychological effects that can come from this. There's also a lot of irony with these clean eaters. So by default, these clean eaters potentially are these bodybuilders, fitness models, other very motivated individuals, and that's an excellent trait. However, there's a lot of irony because you may see people when they include what's called a cheat day within their week. And the irony is they'll be eating quote unquote clean throughout the week, and then they'll have this one day binge. And for some reason they don't seem to realise that calories and macronutrients do actually count on this day. They have this philosophy where if they can essentially eat whatever they want on this binge day and they're not going to gain body fat. I'm telling you right now, they will be gaining body fat. If they're in that net energy surplus, they will be gaining body fat. So there's some irony there when you actually measure out their total food consumption throughout the week, when you look at what's considered clean and what's considered not clean food. You'd be surprised at how much rubbish they eat on the binge day. When you actually add it to their total week, can actually be quite significant. If you compare that to, say, a flexible diet, to someone who follows If It Fits Your Macros properly, in the sense that they're, for the most part, consuming whole foods the majority of the time, and then they just occasionally sprinkle in some more what's considered bad food into their regime. It's also important just to give a big caveat. If you generally do love eating whole food all of the time, then there's absolutely no problem with this whatsoever. So I'm not saying that you have to just suddenly go off the rails and start having more processed food within your diet. You don't have to do whatsoever. I then bring you on to a Alan Aragon principle that he's written about several times on both his site and on several articles, and it's this 10 to 20% principle, where he basically suggests consuming the majority or 80 to 90% of your food from whole food, but at the same time you still have a 10 to 20% leeway to consume foods you wish. Perhaps this will allow you to go out with your friends, go out with your family, to potentially have a Sunday roast at home and not be the only one eating out of a Tupperware container. And you'll be surprised, there are people in the fitness industry that do this. So this 10-20% principle allows you to essentially cover bases. Going back to the Eric Helms pyramid, this allows you to meet total calories, this allows you to meet your macronutrient targets, this allows you to meet micronutrients and minerals because you're consuming lots of fruits and vegetables. And then timing, nutrient timing, frequency and supplements, we'll talk about that on another occasion. So as I've suggested at the start of the podcast, I'm actually going to give you a free gift and some practical information to take away. So if you head over to my site, jameslaytonfitness.co.uk, that's Layton spelled Layton, I actually have a free ebook on my site, and the ebook's called How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan. So if you're unsure of how to set up calories and macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, fats, suitable for you and your goals, this will be a very useful tool for you to use. Now, it's important to note that these calorie formulas do have their limitations, but the key with the ebook is to give you a starting point. Once you've got that starting point plugged in, you can then start measuring your progress on a weekly basis and then manipulate calories and or training from there. So within the ebook, I actually teach you briefly how to potentially make changes for either fat loss or muscle gain to move you closer to your goals. So I just want to conclude everything I've discussed within the podcast. So hopefully there's some big takeaways you can take away from this podcast. One of the key points that I've mentioned a couple of times throughout the episode was, with regards to food, it's more about the dose and composition of that food within an individual's diet. It's very difficult to say whether a food is good or bad in isolation without looking at the rest of the day's nutrition intake, the calories, macronutrients. Without looking at the rest of the week's intake. It's very difficult to be objective when you don't know that individual's goals, lifestyle, training volume, etc. In addition to that, we talked about that very important hierarchy of importance. Total calories comes first, then macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, fats, micronutrients, minerals, water, nutrient timing, frequency, supplements. So really that should be your two big takeaways. Hopefully this will almost open your eyes and give you a new understanding of nutrition. I also wanted to give a big caveat as well before I leave. When I'm referring to and almost deciphering clean eating, at the same time I'm not suggesting you just start going eating as much fast food as possible or quote unquote bad food. The key is just to essentially improve your understanding of nutrition. Know that there's a hierarchy of importance. Know that food quality is important, but at the same time you need to consider all of the other factors. You can still have some quote-unquote processed food or food you enjoy in moderation as long as it comes within your total calories, macronutrients, within your goals. So I just wanted to give that big caveat. So hopefully you've really enjoyed the first episode. This is actually going to be a weekly podcast, and I'm going to be covering as many big topics as possible to really essentially give you more information on how to build muscle and lose fat more effectively, as well as give you more of an evidence-based approach to nutrition and training. So just remember to grab the free ebook on my website. Head over to jameslaytonfitness.co.uk. That's spelled Layton, and you'll see a link at the top of the page. It says free ebook. Click on there, type in your name and email address, and that will be sent to you immediately. So thank you very much for listening to the first podcast. I look forward to the following podcast, and if you've enjoyed the episode, please feel free to leave a review and rating on iTunes. Thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.